On the edge of a vast open plain in Texas where the land stretched endlessly and the sky seemed to touch the earth, there lived a man named John Harper. He was not a wealthy man, nor was he famous. In fact, most people who passed through the area barely noticed him at all. But those who did know John spoke highly of his kindness and quiet strength. His small wooden house stood alone, far from any town or settlement, surrounded by nothing but tall grass, wild flowers, and the occasional herd of deer. It was a lonely life, but John had grown used to it over the years. He spent his days tending to his crops, caring for his animals, and fixing whatever needed repair around the property. For John, solitude was not something to fear. It was simply part of who he was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a storm began to brew. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, blotting out the last light of day. The wind picked up, bending the trees and sending leaves swirling through the air. Lightning cracked across the heavens, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. Rain came down in sheets, pounding against the roof of John's cabin and turning the dry dirt outside into thick mud. Inside, John lit a lantern and sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage on. He wasn't worried. Storms like this were common in these parts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. It wasn't long before his instincts proved right. Just as he was about to pour himself a cup of coffee, he heard a faint sound coming from outside. At first he thought it might be the wind or the creaking of the old wooden beams in his house. But then it came again, a soft knock at the door. Frowning, John set the coffee pot aside and grabbed his rifle just in case. Who could possibly be out here in such weather? Settlers rarely traveled this far from town, especially during a storm, and anyone else would have no reason to visit him. Cautiously, he approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened it, he was greeted by a sight that took his breath away. Standing on his porch, drenched to the bone and shivering violently, was a young girl. She looked no older than 12 or 13, with dark hair plastered to her face and wide, frightened eyes. Her clothes, what little remained of them, were torn and dirty, and she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders as if it were her only lifeline. For a moment, neither of them moved. The girl stared up at him, unsure whether to trust this stranger, while John struggled to process what he was seeing. Finally, he lowered his rifle and stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Come on," he said gently, though he doubted she understood him. "You'll catch your death out there." The girl hesitated for a second longer before stepping inside, her bare feet leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. Once she was in, John closed the door tightly against the howling wind and turned back to face her. Up close, he could see the fear etched into every line of her face. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in days, and there were scratches on her arms and legs that suggested she had been running through rough terrain. Despite her obvious distress, however, there was also a stubbornness in her expression, a determination to survive no matter what. John didn't waste time asking questions. Instead, he grabbed a towel from a nearby shelf and handed it to her, gesturing for her to dry herself off. Then he went to fetch one of his spare blankets and draped it around her shoulders. The girl murmured something in a language he didn't recognize, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. Though he couldn't understand her words, the gratitude in her tone was unmistakable. Satisfied that she was at least somewhat comfortable, John busied himself preparing a meal. He heated some stew over the fire and sliced a piece of bread, placing both on a plate and setting it in front of her. At first, the girl hesitated, eyeing the food suspiciously. But hunger eventually won out, and she began eating slowly, savoring each bite as though it were the best thing she'd ever tasted. As she ate, John studied her more closely. Her features were unmistakably Native American, and based on her clothing, or what was left of it, he guessed she belonged to the Comanche tribe. The Comanche were known throughout the region as fierce warriors, often clashing with settlers over land and resources. John had heard stories of their raids and skirmishes, but he had never encountered them personally. Still, He knew enough to realize that harboring one of their members, even a child, could put him in grave danger. Despite the risks, John couldn't bring himself to turn her away. There was something about the girl's vulnerability that tugged at his heartstrings. She reminded him of his own daughter who had died years ago in a fever outbreak. The memory brought a lump to his throat, but he pushed it aside and focused on the task at hand. After she finished eating, he pointed to himself and said, "John." Then he pointed to her, raising an eyebrow in question. The girl tilted her head, considering him for a moment before replying softly, "Nahimana, Nahimana," John repeated, testing the unfamiliar name on his tongue. It sounded musical, almost poetic. Smiling slightly, he nodded and patted his chest again. "John," the girl smiled back. A small, hesitant smile that made her look younger than she probably was. For the first time since she arrived, some of the tension seemed to leave her body. Encouraged by this, John tried to communicate further, using gestures and simple words to ask where she had come from and why she was alone. Nahimana responded with a series of sentences in her native language, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. While John couldn't understand most of what she said, he caught a few recurring phrases that suggested she had gotten lost or separated from her people. Whether by accident or design, she was now miles away from home, stranded in unfamiliar territory. As the night wore on, the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating the room in brief bursts of light while thunder shook the walls of the cabin. John built up the fire to keep them warm and found an extra mattress for Nahimana to sleep on. She curled up under the blanket, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and soon drifted off into a restless sleep. Watching her, John felt a mixture between protectiveness and unease. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just become infinitely more complicated. For hours after Nahimana fell asleep, John sat by the fire, staring into the flames and thinking. He wondered how she had ended up so far from her tribe and whether they were even aware that she was missing. If they were looking for her, would they assume she had been taken by settlers? And if they discovered she was here, in his home, how would they react? These questions swirled in his mind, keeping him awake long after the storm finally passed and the world outside grew silent. By the time dawn broke, casting pale golden light through the windows, John still hadn't found any answers. All he could do was wait and hope that his decision to help Nahimana wouldn't cost him everything he held dear. When morning arrived, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by rain. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the sun peeked through scattered clouds, casting a warm glow over the landscape. John stepped outside to check on his animals and survey the damage caused by the storm. The fields were soggy and puddles dotted the ground, but everything seemed intact. As he worked, his mind kept drifting back to Nahimana. She was still asleep inside the cabin, her small form curled up under the blanket he had given her. He wondered how she would react when she woke up in this strange place, surrounded by unfamiliar sights and sounds. John's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed movement in the distance. At first it was just a speck on the horizon, barely noticeable against the vast expanse of open land. But as he squinted and shaded his eyes with his hand, the speck grew larger, resolving into shapes. Men on horseback. Dozens of them. His stomach tightened as realization dawned. These weren't ordinary travelers or settlers. Their posture, their attire, and the way they moved in perfect unison told him exactly who they were. Comanche warriors. Panic surged through John's body, but he forced himself to stay calm. He counted quickly, estimating there were at least 70 riders, maybe more. They rode steadily toward his house, their faces painted with bold streaks of red and black, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Feathers adorned their heads and their horses moved with practiced grace. To anyone else, the scene might have been awe-inspiring, even beautiful. But to John, it was terrifying. He knew what these men were capable of, and he couldn't help but wonder if they had come seeking revenge, or worse. Taking a deep breath, John hurried back inside. Nahimana was awake now, sitting upright on the mattress and looking around curiously. When she saw the expression on John's face, her own features clouded with worry. "What is wrong?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're here," John replied simply, pointing toward the window. He didn't need to elaborate. Nahimana understood immediately. Her eyes widened, and she scrambled to her feet, rushing to look outside. For a moment she stood frozen, watching the approaching riders with a mix of fear and relief. Then, without warning, she turned to John and grabbed his arm, speaking rapidly in her native language. Though he couldn't understand her words, the urgency in her tone was clear. John nodded slowly, trying to appear confident despite the knot of dread forming in his stomach. "I'll talk to them," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure whether he was reassuring her or himself. "Stay here. Don't come out unless I say so." Nahimana hesitated, her grip tightening on his sleeve. Whatever she said next was lost in translation, but her meaning was unmistakable. She was scared for him. John gave her a small, reassuring smile before stepping outside once more. The Comanche were closer now, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they approached. John walked forward cautiously, raising his hands high above his head to show he meant no harm. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, hoping to convey peace rather than hostility. The leader of the group, a tall, imposing man with sharp features and piercing eyes, rode ahead of the others, stopping, just a few feet away from John. His presence commanded respect, and there was an undeniable authority in the way he carried himself. He studied John carefully, his gaze sweeping over the modest cabin and the surrounding land. Behind him, the other warriors fanned out, forming a loose semicircle that effectively surrounded the property. John swallowed hard, acutely aware of how outnumbered he was. For several long moments, neither man spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional snort of a horse or the rustle of grass in the breeze. Finally, the Comanche leader broke the tension. "You take, girl," he said in halting English, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with quiet certainty. "Yes," John replied, choosing his words carefully. "She came to my door last night. She was lost, alone, and frightened. I gave her shelter because it was the right thing to do." The leader's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing John's explanation. He exchanged a few quick words with one of his companions, who responded with a nod. Then, turning back to John, he gestured toward the house. "Where is she?" John hesitated, unsure whether bringing Nahimana outside was a good idea. What if they thought he had harmed her? Or worse, what if they decided to punish her for being near a settler? But there was no time to second-guess himself. Slowly, he motioned for Nahimana to join them. She appeared in the doorway moments later, her face pale but resolute. When she saw the leader, her entire demeanor shifted. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she ran forward, throwing herself into his arms. The transformation was immediate. The leader's stern expression softened, and he embraced her tightly. Murmuring something in their language, John watched silently, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Clearly, this man was Nahimana's father, or at least someone very important to her. The warriors around him relaxed slightly, lowering their weapons and exchanging murmurs among themselves. The threat of violence seemed to fade, replaced by a cautious curiosity. After a few minutes, Nahimana pulled away, wiping her tears and looking between John and her father. She began speaking quickly, gesturing animatedly as she explained what had happened. Her father listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a question. Though John couldn't follow the conversation, he could tell that Nahimana was defending him, explaining how he had helped her and kept her safe during the storm. The leader's gaze returned to John, this time with a hint of gratitude mixed with suspicion. "You save her," the leader said finally, his tone softer but still firm. "Why?" John took a step forward, meeting the man's gaze directly. "Because it was the right thing to do," he repeated. "No child should be left alone in the wilderness, especially not in a storm like last night. I didn't know who she was or where she came from. I only knew she needed help. The leader studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "You brave man," he said almost reluctantly. "But you must understand, we do not trust your kind." "I know," John replied honestly, "and I can't blame you. Many of my people have done terrible things to yours, but I'm not like them. I want no trouble. I just want to live in peace." The leader seemed to consider this, glancing back at his warriors before returning his attention to John. There was a long pause, during which the weight of the situation pressed down on everyone present. Finally, the man extended his hand, palm open. It was a gesture of truce, tentative but meaningful. John hesitated only briefly before reaching out and clasping the offered hand. The grip was firm, a silent promise that this moment would not be forgotten. As the Comanche began to dismount and set up camp near the house, John felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew this was far from over. These men were not here simply to retrieve Nahimana. They had questions, and John would need to answer them truthfully if he wanted to maintain their fragile trust. Still, as he looked at Nahimana laughing and talking with her father, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this encounter could lead to something greater than fear and mistrust. Only time would tell. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the Comanche warriors began setting up a temporary camp near John's cabin. They moved with practiced efficiency, unpacking supplies from their horses and arranging them neatly on the ground. Some tended to their mounts, brushing their coats and checking their hooves, while others gathered firewood and started small cooking fires. The air was filled with the sounds of quiet conversation, the occasional whinny of a horse, and the crackle of flames. Despite the peaceful atmosphere, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched closely. Every movement he made seemed to draw attention, and more than once he caught the warriors exchanging glances or murmuring among themselves. Nahimana stayed close to her father, clinging to his side as though afraid he might disappear again. She spoke animatedly, pointing toward the cabin and gesturing toward John. Her father listened intently, nodding occasionally but keeping his eyes fixed on John. It was clear that Nahimana was explaining everything: how she had found shelter during the storm, how John had fed her and kept her warm, and how he had treated her kindly despite not knowing who she was. While John couldn't understand their words, he could see the gratitude in the leader's expression. Still, there was an underlying tension, a sense that this truce was fragile and could shatter at any moment. After a while, the leader motioned for John to join them. Reluctantly, John stepped forward, leaving the safety of his porch and walking toward the group. His heart raced as he approached, but he forced himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that these men were human beings, just like him, and that they had come here not to harm him, but to find Nahimana. If he wanted to keep their trust, he would need to show them respect and honesty. The leader gestured for John to sit by the fire, which he did cautiously, folding his legs beneath him and trying to appear relaxed. Around him, the warriors continued their tasks, but John could feel their eyes on him, studying him carefully. The leader leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and began speaking in broken English. "You say you want peace," said, his voice low and measured. "But why should we believe you?" John took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know my people have hurt yours," he admitted, meeting the man's gaze directly. "I can't change what others have done, but I can tell you this: I'm not like them. I live alone out here because I prefer it. I don't want land or gold or anything else your people have. All I want is to be left alone, to farm my fields, care for my animals, and live quietly." The leader frowned, considering this. "And yet you take my daughter into your home," he countered. "Why? Why risk yourself for someone you do not know?" John hesitated, searching for the right answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "When I saw her standing there, cold and scared, I didn't think about who she was or where she came from. I only thought about what she needed. No child deserves to suffer, no matter who her parents are." The leader's expression softened, slightly, and he glanced at Nahimana, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. For a moment he said nothing, lost in thought. Then, turning back to John, he asked, "Do you know what happens to those who cross the Comanche?" John nodded, solemnly. "Yes, I've heard the stories. Your people are strong and you protect what is yours. I respect that." This seemed to please the leader, who gave a small approving nod. "Then you must also understand why we cannot trust easily. Many settlers lie. They smile and promise peace. But behind our backs, they steal our land, kill our animals, and destroy our way of life." "I understand," John replied earnestly, "and I won't ask you to trust me blindly. But I hope that over time, you'll see that I mean what I say. I don't want trouble. I never have." The leader studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching John's face for any sign of deceit. Finally, he leaned back, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. "We will see," he said simply. "Time will tell if your words are true." With that, the conversation shifted. The leader introduced himself as Taza, a name that rolled off his tongue with pride. He explained that Nahimana was his youngest child, and that she had wandered off during a raid gone wrong. When they realized she was missing, panic had spread through the tribe, prompting them to send out search parties in every direction. They had tracked her trail to John's cabin, expecting the worst, but instead, they found her safe and unharmed. Taza admitted that he had been prepared to fight, when they arrived convinced that John had taken her against her will. Now, however, he was beginning to see things differently. As the morning wore on, the mood around the camp grew less tense. The warriors relaxed visibly, some even laughing and joking among themselves. Taza invited John to share a meal with them, offering him roasted meat and flatbread cooked over the fire. Though John wasn't sure what kind of meat it was, he accepted graciously, knowing that refusing would be seen as disrespectful. The food was simple but flavorful, and as he ate, he found himself warming to the men around him. They weren't so different from him, really. They cared for their families, valued loyalty, and sought to protect what mattered most to them. Throughout the meal, Nahimana sat between John and Taza, acting as a bridge between two worlds. She translated bits of their conversation, helping John understand Taza's questions and vice versa. Her presence brought a sense of ease to the gathering, softening the edges of mistrust that still lingered in the air. At one point, Taza turned to her and asked something in their language. She smiled brightly and nodded, then reached out to touch John's arm. Whatever she said next caused Taza to chuckle softly, a rare sound that lightened the mood even further. By midday, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as a standoff was now starting to feel like a tentative friendship. The warriors no longer glared at John suspiciously. Instead, they greeted him with nods and grunts of acknowledgement. Some even offered him gifts, a beautifully carved knife, a feathered arrow, and a small pouch of herbs. These tokens were meant to show appreciation, and John accepted them humbly, expressing his thanks in the best way he knew how. As the afternoon sun warmed the earth, Taza called John aside for another private conversation. This time the tone was less confrontational and more reflective. "You have shown kindness to my daughter," Taza said, his voice softer now. "For that, I am grateful. But there is something else I must ask of you." "Anything," John replied without hesitation. "If it's within my power, I'll do it." Taza hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. "My people, we have suffered much at the hands of settlers. We hear promises of peace, but they are often empty. If you truly wish to live in harmony with us, you must prove it, not just to me, but to all of us." John nodded, understanding the weight of the request. "How?" he asked simply. "Speak to your people," Taza urged. "Tell them that we are not savages, as they call us. Tell them that we seek only to protect our land and our way of life. Perhaps, if enough of you listen, we can find a way to coexist." It was a tall order, and John knew it. Convincing other settlers to see the Comanche as equals, or even as allies, wouldn't be easy. Many harbored deep-seated fears and prejudices, fueled by years of conflict and misunderstanding. But as he looked around at the faces of the warriors, at Nahimana smiling shyly beside her father, he realized that it was worth trying. If he could help build a bridge between their worlds, however fragile it might be, it would be a step toward something greater. "I'll do it," John promised, his voice steady. "I can't guarantee that everyone will listen, but I'll try. That's all I can offer." Taza regarded him for a moment, then extended his hand once more. This time the gesture was warmer, almost friendly. "Good," he said with a slight smile. "Perhaps there is hope for us yet." As the day drew to a close, the Comanche began packing up their camp, preparing to leave. Taza thanked John again, clasping his shoulder firmly before mounting his horse. Nahimana lingered for a moment longer, giving John a shy wave and mouthing the word "thank you" in English. Then, with a final glance back, she joined her father, and together they rode off into the horizon, disappearing into the golden light of the setting sun. Watching them go, John felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. He had survived the encounter, but he knew his journey was far from over. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and doubts. Yet as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the plains, he allowed himself a small measure of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The days following the Comanche's departure were quiet, almost too quiet for John. The vast plains around his cabin seemed emptier than before, as if the brief presence of Taza and his warriors had left an invisible mark on the land. John spent his time tending to his chores, but his mind kept drifting back to the encounter. He replayed every moment in his head: the tense standoff, the cautious conversations, and the eventual truce. Each memory felt like a piece of a puzzle he was still trying to solve. What had he done right? And more importantly, what would come next? Word of the incident spread quickly among the nearby settlers. News traveled fast in those parts, carried by traders, hunters, and anyone passing through. By the end of the week, John's name was on everyone's lips. Some admired his bravery, calling him a hero for standing up to the Comanche and earning their respect. Others were less kind, whispering behind his back about how reckless he had been. "He's lucky they didn't kill him," one man muttered at the local trading post. "Mark my words, it's only a matter of time before they come back for revenge." John heard these comments whenever he ventured into town, which wasn't often. He tried not to let them bother him, reminding himself that people were afraid. Fear made them say things they didn't mean, lash out at others, or cling to old prejudices. Still, the weight of their judgment pressed down on him, making him question whether he had made the right choice. Was it worth risking his safety, and perhaps the safety of others, for the sake of one girl? Despite the doubts swirling in his mind, John couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. Every time he thought about Nahimana's frightened face, on that stormy night, he knew he would do it all over again. She had been alone, vulnerable, and in need of help. How could he have turned her away? The memory of her smile as she left with her father stayed with him, a reminder that kindness could sometimes bridge even the widest divides. But kindness alone wasn't enough to change the world. That much became clear when John began fulfilling his promise to Taza. He started small, talking to his neighbors and sharing what he had learned about the Comanche. He told them about Taza's strength and dignity, about Nahimana's laughter and courage, and about the warriors' willingness to listen once they saw he meant no harm. He urged them to see the Comanche not as enemies but as human beings with families, hopes, and dreams just like theirs. At first, some listened. A few farmers nodded thoughtfully, admitting they had never really considered the Comanche's perspective before. One elderly woman even remarked, "Maybe we've been too quick to judge. If Harper can earn their trust, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." But for every person who listened, there were two who scoffed or shook their heads dismissively. "You're naive, John," one man said bluntly. "Those savages will slit your throat the moment it suits them. Don't forget that." The skepticism stung, but John refused to give up. He knew changing minds wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and proof that peace was possible. So he continued speaking, planting seeds of understanding wherever he went. He visited neighboring farms, attended church gatherings, and joined discussions at the trading post. Slowly, very slowly, he began to notice a shift. People weren't necessarily convinced, but they were starting to think, at least a little. One afternoon, as John was working in his fields, he noticed a group of riders approaching in the distance. His heart skipped a beat as memories of Taza's arrival flooded back. Were the Comanche returning? Had something gone wrong? Gripping his hoe tightly, he waited until the figures came closer. To his relief, they weren't Comanche warriors, but a group of settlers led by a man named Samuel Briggs, a well-known rancher in the area. Samuel was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and a reputation for being outspoken. He rarely minced words, and when he spoke, people listened. "Harper," Samuel called out as he dismounted, his tone somewhere between curiosity and accusation. "We need to talk." John wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded, gesturing for the group to follow him to the shade of a nearby tree. Once they were seated, Samuel got straight to the point. "We've heard about your dealings with the Comanche," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Some folks are saying you've gone soft, letting them walk all over you. Others think you're playing a dangerous game. So tell us, what's really going on?" John sighed, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I'm not playing any games," he replied calmly. "All I did was help a child who needed shelter. Her father showed up looking for her, and instead of causing trouble, he thanked me. We talked, shared a meal, and parted ways peacefully. That's all there is to it." Samuel frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "And now you're running around telling everyone we should make nice with them? You realize how risky that is, don't you? One wrong move, and they'll burn us all to the ground." "I know the risks," John admitted. "But I also know that living in fear isn't the answer. Every time we assume the worst about them, we push them further away. If we want peace, we have to start somewhere." The other settlers exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring among themselves. Samuel leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Peace sounds good in theory, Harper, but it doesn't put food on the table or keep our families safe. What happens when the Comanche decide they want more than just handshakes and promises? What then?" John met Samuel's gaze steadily. "Then we'll deal with it. But if we don't try, if we keep treating them like animals instead of people, we'll never get anywhere. Isn't it worth a shot?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the rustling of leaves overhead. Finally, one of the younger men in the group cleared his throat and spoke up. "Maybe Harper's got a point," he said hesitantly. "I mean, fighting hasn't solved anything so far. Maybe it's time to try something different." To John's surprise, several others nodded in agreement. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Samuel certainly wasn't. But the fact that some were willing to consider his perspective gave him hope. As the discussion continued, John found himself fielding questions and addressing concerns, doing his best to explain why coexistence was better than conflict. By the time the group left, they hadn't reached a consensus, but they had planted the seed of possibility. Over the weeks that followed, John threw himself into building bridges between the settlers and the Comanche. He organized meetings, facilitated conversations, and acted as a mediator whenever tensions flared. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments when it felt like everything was falling apart. But he persisted. Slowly, trust began to grow, fragile but real. One evening, as John sat by his fire reflecting on the progress he had made, he heard hoofbeats outside. Grabbing his rifle, he stepped cautiously onto the porch. To his astonishment, it was Taza and a small group of warriors. They carried no weapons this time, only bundles of goods, dried meat, woven blankets, and intricately crafted tools. Taza dismounted and approached John with a smile, holding out a beautifully decorated bow and quiver of arrows. "For you," Taza said simply, placing the gift in John's hands. "A token of gratitude. You have kept your word, and so have we." John stared at the bow, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." Taza nodded, his expression serious. "The road ahead will not be easy, but together we can walk it. Remember this. Trust is like fire. It must be nurtured, or it will die." As Taza and his men rode off into the twilight, John stood there clutching the bow and feeling a deep sense of purpose. He knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while he felt hopeful. Peace was possible. It just required effort, patience, and faith. And John Harper was ready to give it everything he had. The days turned into weeks, and John Harper's life began to take on a rhythm unlike anything he had known before. His mornings started early, as they always had, with the sun casting long shadows across the fields. But now, instead of focusing solely on his crops and animals, he found himself devoting much of his time to fostering the fragile bond between the settlers and the Comanche. It was exhausting work, full of challenges and setbacks, but it also brought moments of unexpected joy and connection. One such moment came when Taza and his warriors returned for another visit. This time, they brought not only gifts, but also their families, women and children who watched curiously from horseback as they approached John's cabin. The sight filled John with both pride and nervousness. He knew this was a significant gesture. Allowing their loved ones to come near a settler's home meant that Taza and his people were beginning to trust him more deeply. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how the settlers would react if they saw this scene. Would they see it as a sign of progress or as a threat? As the Comanche set up camp near his house, John greeted them warmly, doing his best to make them feel welcome. He offered water and food, though Taza insisted they had brought enough supplies for everyone. The children especially fascinated John. They laughed and played, chasing each other through the tall grass and pointing at the chickens pecking around the yard. One little boy, no older than 6, tugged shyly at John's sleeve and held out a small wooden carving, a crude but charming likeness of a horse. John accepted it with a smile, ruffling the boy's hair in thanks. The child beamed, then ran back to his mother, chattering excitedly in their language. Watching these interactions, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. These weren't faceless enemies, as so many settlers believed. They were families, just like his own neighbors. They cared for their children, shared meals together, and celebrated simple joys. Yet he also understood why fear lingered on both sides. Years of conflict had left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. Building trust required patience and proof that neither side intended harm. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John joined Taza and his family by the fire. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wild sage, and the stars began to twinkle overhead. For a while, no one spoke. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the crackling flames and the occasional murmur of conversation among the Comanche. Finally, Taza leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You have done well," he said, his voice low but warm. "Your people listen to you." John shook his head modestly. "Not all of them," he admitted. "Some still don't trust your tribe, and some of mine are too afraid to even try. But I keep talking to them. Maybe someday they'll change their minds." Taza nodded slowly, understanding the difficulty of what John was attempting. "Change is hard," he agreed. "Even for us. Many in my tribe question why we should trust settlers after all they have done. But I tell them, if we do not try, nothing will ever improve. We must lead by example." His words struck a chord with John. Leadership wasn't something he had ever sought, but here he was, caught between two worlds, trying to guide them toward peace. It was a heavy responsibility, one that weighed on him constantly. At times, he doubted whether he was the right person for the task. Who was he, after all, to bridge centuries of mistrust and hatred? But then he remembered Nahimana's smile, Taza's gratitude, and the laughter of the Comanche children. Those moments reminded him why he couldn't give up. The next morning, John decided to take a bold step. He invited several settlers to meet the Comanche at his cabin. It was a risky move, and he knew it. Some might refuse to come, while others might arrive armed and ready for trouble. But he believed it was necessary. If the settlers could see the Comanche as real people, with families, traditions, and hopes, they might begin to let go of their fears. To his relief, a small group agreed to attend. Among them was Samuel Briggs, whose skepticism remained strong but who seemed curious enough to give it a chance. When they arrived, John greeted them warmly, urging them to sit by the fire, alongside Taza and his family. The atmosphere was tense at first, with both sides exchanging wary glances. But as the day went on, barriers began to fall. The Comanche women showed off their intricate beadwork, explaining the meanings behind the patterns. The men demonstrated their skill with bows and arrows, inviting the settlers to try shooting targets. Even Samuel, initially reluctant, found himself laughing as he fumbled with an arrow. By the end of the gathering, something remarkable had happened. While no one declared immediate friendship, there was a newfound respect in the air. A few settlers stayed behind to ask questions about Comanche customs, while others expressed interest in trading goods. Taza, for his part, assured them that his people were open to peaceful coexistence, provided both sides honored their promises. As the days passed, John continued working tirelessly to nurture this fledgling relationship. He organized more meetings, encouraged trade between the settlers and the Comanche, and acted as a mediator whenever disputes arose. Not every interaction went smoothly. There were misunderstandings, accusations, and moments of anger, but each challenge taught him something new about patience and diplomacy. One particularly tense incident involved a misunderstanding over livestock. A settler claimed that the Comanche had stolen several of his cattle, while the Comanche argued that the animals had wandered onto their land and were simply being cared for until they could be returned. Tempers flared on both sides, and for a brief, terrifying moment it seemed like violence might break out. But John stepped in, calming everyone down and suggesting a compromise. The cattle would remain with the Comanche until the settler could verify ownership, at which point they would be returned without argument. Both parties reluctantly agreed, and though the resolution wasn't perfect, it prevented bloodshed. Through it all, John never forgot the faces of those who doubted him. There were still settlers who refused to engage with the Comanche, dismissing his efforts as foolish or dangerous. And within the Comanche tribe, there were voices of dissent, warning against trusting the white man too much. But John focused on the positives, the growing number of friendships, the increasing willingness to communicate, and the gradual erosion of fear. Late one night, as he sat alone by the fire, John reflected on how far he had come. From the stormy night when Nahimana appeared on his doorstep to the present day, his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He thought about Taza's words. Trust is like fire. It must be nurtured, or it will die. Those words echoed in his mind, reminding him that the work was never truly finished. Peace was a living thing, requiring constant care and attention. As the flames flickered and danced, John felt a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the courage to follow his heart, and for the hope that tomorrow might bring even greater understanding. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. After all, he had seen firsthand what kindness and determination could achieve, and that knowledge gave him strength. Months passed, and the fragile bond between the settlers and the Comanche grew stronger, though it remained delicate. John Harper continued to play a central role in maintaining this connection, acting as both a mediator and a bridge between two worlds that had once viewed each other as enemies. His days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and efforts to ease tensions whenever they arose. It was hard work, often thankless, but he found meaning in every small victory, a shared meal, a successful trade, or even just a smile exchanged across cultural lines. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, John received an unexpected visitor. A young Comanche man rode up to his cabin, leading a horse laden with bundles of furs and dried meat. The rider introduced himself as Cuyamaca, one of Taza's nephews. He explained that his uncle had sent him with a message. The tribe wanted to invite the settlers to a special gathering, an event meant to celebrate their growing friendship. John listened carefully, his heart swelling with hope. This was more than just a gesture. It was a sign that trust was deepening on both sides. Still, he knew not everyone would be eager to attend. Many settlers still harbored fears and suspicions, while others simply didn't see the point in engaging with the Comanche. But John believed this gathering could be a turning point, a chance to solidify the bonds they had worked so hard to build. Over the next few days, John traveled from farm to farm, speaking to his neighbors about the invitation. He described the Comanche's generosity, their willingness to share their traditions, and the importance of showing mutual respect. Some were hesitant, needing time to think, but others agreed to come, intrigued by the idea of learning more about their former adversaries. By the time the day of the gathering arrived, a modest group of settlers had committed to attending, including Samuel Briggs, who admitted gruffly that he wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The meeting took place in a wide-open clearing, near the Comanche camp, surrounded by tall trees whose leaves blazed with fall colors. When the settlers arrived, they were greeted warmly by Taza and his people. Blankets had been spread on the ground and food was laid out in abundance. Roasted buffalo meat, fresh corn, wild berries, and sweet honey cakes made from mesquite flour. Children ran freely, laughing and playing games, while elders sat together, sharing stories and songs. For many of the settlers, it was their first real glimpse into Comanche life, and they watched with curiosity and wonder. As the afternoon wore on, the celebration shifted to demonstrations of skill and tradition. Comanche warriors performed intricate dances, their movements telling stories of hunts, battles, and unity. Archers showcased their precision with bows and arrows, hitting targets from impressive distances. Women displayed their craftsmanship, explaining the significance of patterns woven into blankets and beadwork sewn onto clothing. The settlers, initially reserved, gradually joined in, asking questions and marveling at the beauty of the Comanche way of life. At one point, Taza stood and addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Through Nahimana, who translated for the settlers, he spoke of gratitude, for the land, for their ancestors, and for the opportunity to forge new friendships. "We are not so different," he said, his eyes sweeping over the gathered faces. "We all seek safety, prosperity, and happiness for our families. Let us continue walking this path together." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from both sides. Even Samuel, who rarely showed emotion, nodded thoughtfully. His usual scowl softened into something resembling respect. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the atmosphere turned festive. Musicians played flutes and drums, and soon, settlers and Comanche alike were dancing together, their laughter mingling in the cool evening air. For John, standing off to the side and watching the scene unfold, it was a moment of profound fulfillment. He had dreamed of such harmony for months, and now, seeing it come to life before his eyes, he felt a deep sense of pride. Yet he also knew that challenges lay ahead. Peace was never guaranteed. It required constant effort, compromise, and understanding. But tonight, under the starlit sky, it felt possible. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between the settlers and the Comanche continued to evolve. Trade became more frequent, with both groups exchanging goods that enriched their lives. Settlers brought tools, cloth, and metal implements, while the Comanche offered furs, herbs, and knowledge of the land. Disputes still arose occasionally, but they were resolved through dialogue rather than violence, thanks largely to John's persistence in fostering open communication. Word of this unusual alliance spread beyond the immediate area, reaching neighboring towns and settlements. Some dismissed it as impractical or naive, while others saw it as proof that coexistence was possible. Inspired by John's example, a few communities began reaching out to nearby tribes, hoping to replicate his success. Though progress was slow and uneven, the ripple effects of John's efforts began to spread, creating pockets of peace where none had existed before. Despite the growing optimism, John remained humble. He knew better than anyone how fragile these connections were and how easily fear and misunderstanding could reignite old conflicts. But he refused to dwell on the negatives. Instead, he focused on the positives, the friendships formed, the lives touched, and the seeds of hope planted in fertile soil. One evening, as winter approached and the air grew colder, John sat by his fire reflecting on everything that had happened. The stormy night when Nahimana appeared on his doorstep felt like a lifetime ago, yet it had set him on a path he never could have imagined. He thought about Taza's wisdom, the courage of his fellow settlers, and the resilience of the Comanche people. Most of all, he thought about the power of kindness, a simple act that had sparked a chain reaction of change. As the flames danced and crackled, John allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. He had done his part to make the world a little brighter, and perhaps, in doing so, he had given others the courage to do the same. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings.